whatever it is that'll please you, I'll do it. I want to talk about the infamous argument that happened between Paul McCartney and George Harrison on Monday the 6th of January 1969, where the Beatles had reconvened in order to continue work on what was going to be the Let It Be album eventually. Paul and George face to face with guitars trying to work out the arrangement for the song The Two of Us, which was a Paul McCartney song, and George and Paul and John were jamming, trying to get it right, and various things are said, various things happen, and there's this, not actually the climax of the argument. It's quite interesting in retrospect when you see the full clip or you hear the full clip. The conversation goes on quite a long way past this part, but you get to that moment where George says, look, I'll play what you want me to play, or I won't play anything if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that'll please you, I'll do it. Those words are writ large in Beatles legend. If you're a Beatles fan, you'll have known those words for so many years. You know, I don't remember when I first encountered the clip. It might have been in the Complete Beatles documentary, which I saw when I was about 17. For me, certainly, the scene it's emblazoned into my mind, into my memory, and into my DNA as a Beatles fan. And I guess I was just thinking about this again and just wondering, why did that particular scene become so emblematic, or so, why did it become such a kind of iconic scene? And why did people for so many years, or why have people for so many years set such significance by it? They've read things into it, they've seen it as a symbol for the Beatles' disintegration, and for apparently for the bad spirit that was happening in the studios at the time. It's really interesting in more recent times, thanks to the Peter Jackson documentary. We've seen that, at least in the way that Peter Jackson chose the footage and cut it together, that those sessions for Get Back, even though they had some problems, there were definitely things that were not going right with the Beatles at the time. There were business troubles, there were personal difficulties going on. The sessions were a lot less heavy than we've been led to believe. There were heavy days, there were days where the Beatles were bored, disaffected, sniping at each other, but there were also a lot of good days as well, a lot of good playing, an awful lot of good work done. I think in George's case in particular, when you watch those sessions, George is somebody who was always very careful with what he was going to play. He would sit down very slowly, working things out, and he would try this, he would try that. I think it was a bit of a bone of contention maybe in the Beatles with somebody like Paul McCartney, whose working methods were, probably quite different, much more instinctive, much more of a quick operator. I think Paul has always had in his mind a vision of not just the song but the actual record. He's always got a good sense, I think, as he embarks on a recording, sort of how he wants it to sound, how he wants it to turn up. Whereas I think George was more of a groper. He would grope his way inch by inch, trying to feel his way into an arrangement. And I think if you watch the Get Back sessions, you can see George doing that. He's kind of hunched over his guitar all the time, clearly very intently at work. But then if you cut to the rooftop scene, what a wonderful performance he gives. All his guitar parts are amazing. He's absolutely with them, great ensemble playing. There's no sense of fracture at all, musical fracture, when you watch the rooftop concert. George and Paul, John and Ringo, all four of them are working in sublime harmony at that point. So, not true to say that the Get Back sessions were just pure misery, but there certainly were some conflicts, and for some reason this particular conflict, this I'll play what you want me to play conflict, is the one that has become really iconic over the years. And I was really just wanting to pose the question, why is that? Why this particular argument? And I suppose I've got a couple of theories. I think one thing is that the Beatles always sold their image to the world really as being the four-headed monster, the four guys who conquered the world and were great friends. And it was a picture of themselves which they developed very carefully in conjunction with Brian Epstein, this incredibly cohesive unit really, where it was one for all for one. And that was largely, or it was incredibly enhanced, I think, by the Beatles movies up to date. So the first one, Hard Day's Night, which was meant to be a bit of a snapshot of these four jolly lads right at the cusp of Beatlemania, really, and really enjoying the first really huge flush of fame that they were going to have. The Help movie was still the same thing. It was the four Beatles having fun, being wacky. The great scene at the start where they go through the four separate front doors, which all converge in the same living area. Just this wonderful myth that the Beatles all lived together in supreme harmony. And even in Yellow Submarine, you had that sense where Ringo is going through the corridor, sort of opening the doors, and you get this kind of sense that all four Beatles are all kind of living in this strange, wacky place. So this kind of sense of a kind of male bonding thing, really. I mean, the Beatles were the ultimate examples of that. Four guys just absolutely living together, working together, having a great time together. And the music, of course, which they made, was always characterized by just this feeling of love and joy and harmony and togetherness. And it was the swinging 60s. And we're all meant to be getting on together, and we're all meant to be having a great time together and loving each other. So, in retrospect, fans know that there was an awful lot of bad shit going down towards the end of the Beatles' career. But if you think about it, back in the day, most of that would have been happening behind closed doors. Most of it wouldn't really be known by the fan base, by the general public. These things were not being reported in the newspapers all the time. When Ringo stormed out of the White Album sessions, that wouldn't have been in the newspapers. Nowadays it would be, if the drummer from Coldplay stormed out after a huge argument, it would probably be in all the tabloids. But back in those days, that wasn't news, that wasn't considered news. And all the various rows the Beatles had had, there are lots of different examples. There was Paul storming out of the studio doing the She Said, She Said sessions. Nobody would have really known about that. And I think, obviously, when the shit hit the fan finally and the Beatles broke up, the fans would have been just really drawn towards seeing any evidence that any of that stuff had gone on. And I think there's something very toe-curlingly embarrassing in a way about that particular sequence where you see George and Paul having this little sort of trying to keep the tension under wraps. Essentially what's going on is that Paul wants them to try and structure this song of his, The Two of Us, and George, I think Paul feels that George is just playing too much, he's just improvising too much around the chords. Paul wants them to block the song out first and then complicate it in his words. This had come off the back of a previous contretemps, shall we say, where Paul had basically told George not to echo his vocal melodies between the lines in Hey Jude. So this thing had sort of happened before, essentially Paul telling George not to play something. So they're sort of having this little row, or trying to do it not as a row, trying to be constructive with each other, but clearly getting more and more exasperated while the camera's running. If you put yourself in that situation, it is pretty embarrassing, and to watch them doing it, I think it's almost like it was an early example of reality TV, really. I mean, we're all so used to that now. We watch reality TV shows with people having just ridiculous arguments over nothing, and we all watch it and we accept it. It's just part of the fabric of everyday life. But I think back in those days, back in the early 1970s, the thought of watching people having an actual argument that was, not scripted, not contrived at all, and one which is done in quiet tones. It's not a big blazing row. This is what's quite interesting about it. This sort of argument that they have, it's not people throwing things, throwing chairs and shouting. It's all very, very low key. I'm thinking about Queen, who were around only a couple of years later when they were making their first album. Their producer later said that they used to throw crockery at each other in the studio. The arguments they used to have, all about the music, all about the arrangements. Freddie Mercury used to get in a terrible state, and they would lock themselves in cupboards and throw glasses at each other, screaming at each other in the studio. Dreadful rows, terrible rows. It's hard to imagine now, seeing that, on TV. If you imagine that the Beatles had done something like that, but they never did, or if they did do it, we never saw it. It was just. All we got really was this very quiet scene of discord that was probably not anything out of the ordinary at the time. It was just a band trying to get the stuff together in the studio. I think probably Beatles fans needed something to grasp hold of once the band had broken up, something emblematic, something which they could point to and say to themselves, look, there is the evidence that the Beatles could not work together anymore. And of course, a few days later, George did actually leave the band. But even that, we were told back in the day, oh yeah, George stormed out one day. But when you watch the clip, he doesn't really storm out. It's incredibly low key. He just very quietly just says, right, I think I'll be leaving the band now. And I think somebody has to ask him and say, what? Pardon? And he just says, I think I'll be leaving the band now. And he just walks out, George George could be quite sulky. I think he could be quite resentful. This argument, I think it's also achieved this great mythic status in a way because it seemed to tap in, or it seemed to represent something that was very true about Paul and George, and it was something which in later years George confirmed himself. During the anthology, he said Paul was always the big brother, in a patronising way. Paul got George into the band. George was only a young lad at the time. John maybe wouldn't have even have let him in the band had Paul not spoken out for him. So there was always this uncomfortable thing going down between Paul and George. And of course, as well, Paul and George had never cemented any kind of songwriting partnership, unlike Paul and John. So all sorts of strange, simmering resentments going on. And I think, really, seeing that sequence, it's priceless, really, for the little glimpse that it gives you into a very particular and specific working relationship between these two guys, which essentially was breaking down at this point. And of course, the Alan Klein thing, which was not just between Paul and George, it was between Paul and all of the other three Beatles. It's interesting in this particular clip. The clip that we saw for years was just Paul and George, but John is there too. He's just out of shot, also trying to make constructive statements. I suppose the final thing is, I think the clip has been used often to demonstrate what happened post Brian Epstein. Because I think during that sequence, I think Paul starts to make references to, oh, I keep trying to be the boss of the band because we need somebody to step in and do the job. But every time I do that, it annoys people. And Paul expresses that during the sequence. He says, I don't want to take control of this situation. John actually suggests that he does so. He says, I think Paul is leading the session, so Paul should be the one to call the shots. And Paul kind of says, no, I don't want to do that. But you can sort of tell from listening to the tone of voice that Paul is adopting throughout that little sequence. He has this kind of hectoring tone to his voice, this slightly sort of a slightly naggy kind of tone, a bit like a sort of naggy dad who's trying not to get cross with his son, but he still wanted him to do something and really wanting to get him to see things his way, but also being very passive aggressive. Paul constantly saying, I'm not trying to get at you. I'm not doing anything bad here. I'm just trying to get us to work together. And at a distance, you can tell from listening to it, you just think, guys, just break off, have a cup of tea, have a cigarette or something. This is not going anywhere. There's no point bickering about this. And I think as a scene, it absolutely captures that. So, yeah, I think despite the fact that this argument, so-called, is just nothing compared to some arguments that would have happened between bands over the years, including the Beatles, it's hardly anything, really. Hardly anything to write home about at all. But just for one reason or another, it just became emblematic.